Hi, everybody. You're here today for episode 2 of the Douglas Social Credit Podcast. My name is William Waite. I'm here with Professor Oliver Haydorn, and we're going to be talking today about the ongoing insistence on full employment and the effects that this has over the economy. Oliver, would you like to introduce the topic a bit further?
Right. So one of the core axioms of the existing economic order, which we just take for granted more or less, is this idea that everyone who is able should be employed. That between, let's say, the ages of 18 and 65, unless you're too sick or you've got a disability or well, there are other, you're in school or doing something else, there's an expectation that most people will have to work for a living and they have to find employment, either be self-employed or work for someone else. And that's the way that the majority of people get an income so they can have access to goods and services. And this sort of policy, from a physical standpoint, it makes a certain amount of sense when you have a physical need for everybody to be involved in the provision of goods and services. In other words, if we need all hands on deck, if we need everyone to be working in order for society to have access to the goods and services that we need to survive and flourish, then it makes a certain amount of sense. But one of the things that Douglas pointed out is that with the introduction of power-driven machinery, with the advent of the industrial era, and this is only intensified as machines have become more and more complicated, and now we've got automation and AI. The need to have everyone working, the need for human labor has been substantially reduced. So one point we might make is that from a physical assessment of the economy's potential, we actually don't require all hands on deck. We actually don't require everyone to be working in order for us to provide the whole population with the goods and services that they need to survive and flourish, thanks to the labor that's done by machinery. Power-driven machinery allows us to produce more, and it, many instances, allows us to produce things that couldn't be produced otherwise, or to produce things better. And so
Douglas described human involvement in industry, in the machine and automation age more as in terms of a catalyst, didn't he? That the actual energy which enabled the production, in mass production systems was not, of course, human energy at all. It wasn't human muscular energy. It's mainly solar energy through oil, through coal, and now, of course, through, solar energy directly. So, you can think of like quantity of production, more as something proportional to the amount of energy run through the system. And if you look at it that way, human energy is just a minuscule quantity of energy by comparison to other types. It's more human involvement is more in terms of design, like design for the things we want, the quality of the things we want, how much we want of it. It's not really necessary for the production itself these days.
Right. So economics is supposed to be about efficiency, right? Getting the most for the least. So if we look at the economy, the physical economy, if things were arranged in an efficient manner, in an economic manner, we would have an economy where we would only employ as many people as is necessary to actually get the job done, which would mean at our current level of technology, perhaps only, I'm just throwing this number out there, but perhaps only 20% or 25% of the available labor force is actually strictly required to get the job done. And if that's the case, why insist on a policy of full employment where, apart from the exceptions that I mentioned, everyone is expected to work between 18 and 65 or 67, whatever the retirement age is? Why insist on that when, all of that extra labor actually doesn't serve any real physical purpose? Now, we know why we have full employment, because again, under the rules of the existing system, people have to get an income. And for the vast majority who don't have ownership or don't have an inheritance, the only way to get that income is work. They have to work for it. So it's really because we have to distribute incomes that we insist on a policy of full employment. It's not because of any physical necessity grounded in the nature of production.
It's as though this idea of economic efficiency applies in every way except to humans, isn't it? Like we want to be efficient in our resource use, and we want to get the most out of everything, except we need to employ the full stock of human labor. So it's not really an efficient system in terms of human labor, is what we're saying, really.
Right. And anyone who has environmental concerns, whatever they may be, should see that what we're saying is correct. It makes no sense. If you want to conserve resources, if you want to minimize pollution, minimize destruction of the natural world, it makes no sense to insist that no, everyone's got to work when there's no, in terms of the real purpose of economic association, there is no actual necessity for that. Any necessity is purely artificial because of the financial rules that we've imposed on the physical economic system.
There is a very strong and influential moral argument for full employment, isn't there? Which sort of pervades the whole discussion. I mean, on the one hand, it's quite true what you've been saying, that to provide the things we need, we don't need everybody working. In fact, we have quite a few people who aren't working. I think the participation rate is about 60%. So two and three are working anyway. Only 2 in 3 are working anyway. We don't need all these people working, but if we abandon the policy of full employment, we're going to have widespread demoralization amongst the public. They won't want to do anything. They'll take to drink. They'll take to all sorts of horrible things. And this is kind of a real obstacle in getting people to understand, to make the common sense move away from the insistence on full employment.
Yes, and part of that, I think, is bound up with how we deal with the unemployed right now. So you have welfare systems, unemployment insurance, things like that. Because, of course, if a person needs to work but they can't find a job, because even though we've got a policy of full employment, we actually can't provide a job for everybody, and some people fall through the cracks. We can't leave them to starve, so we have to create some sort of system to catch them. But under that existing system, we also, of course, are giving people an incentive. May not be a very great incentive, because I don't think, for example, in Australia, I don't think the welfare payments are really all that significant. It's hard to understand how some people survive on them, honestly. But nevertheless, there is a bit of an incentive there not to, improve your condition, because you'll lose your benefits. Right? So part of what's going on, I suppose, is that people see that people on welfare, some of them, not all of them, but they may be inclined to live on welfare as long as possible, and mainly because they don't want to lose their benefits. If they start doing some work, a little bit of work on the side, They have to report all of that, and then their benefits may be reduced, or they may no longer qualify for benefits. So, uh, in the existing welfare system, because of the way it's structured, it doesn't. In itself, it's demoralizing, right? So we're not saying that the answer, of course, to this is put people on welfare. We have a different solution, but from a Douglas social credit standpoint. But the important thing to realize is that our whole society, for many years, has been focused on the job as if you will, the purpose of existence. Everyone has to have a job, and the whole schooling system is geared to preparing people for work. And so we have a whole culture that revolves around employment and jobs and things like this. And it wasn't always that way. There have been times and places in the past where people didn't work as much as they do now, believe it or not. In the Middle Ages, according to various historians, in Merry England, for example, the average peasant only worked about 15 weeks of the year. They had 150 official holidays every year, and the sky didn't fall. So
that was more of a system based around the necessities of seasonal fluctuations and when things were happening in the agricultural world, wasn't it?
yes, yes,
Rather than, I mean, the machine has delivered us from that sort of nature forced labor, but it seems that just as we've become free of the necessity for that sort of work, we've been caught up in this like man forced labor. We have to submit to a boss, or we have to submit to the strictures of the market, or whatever that means.
right.
So it's sort of like the whole edifice of industrial style production has done little for making us freer people. In fact, I would say that, as you were saying, we are less free than we have been in the past, even though we have all this marvelous machinery and to do our work for us.
Yes, it's, from a purely physical assessment of our situation, economic life should be easier now than ever before in human history.
Yeah.
And yet, because the financial system is poorly designed, it doesn't reflect reality. For many people, at least in financial terms, things are quite difficult, far more difficult than they should be, and far more difficult than they had been in the past, and even in the relatively recent past. So this is not, something's wrong when we have physical progress, but it's not being sort of manifested on the financial plane, right? Where the more we advance physically, the harder it becomes to make the books balance and to make ends meet. And we have an explanation for all of that, as far as Douglas social credit is concerned. But these are things that people just sort of assume are inherent to the nature of the world we live in, when it's not so at all. This is all a result of the financial and economic superstructure, the software, if you will, that we run our economies on, which is dishonest and dysfunctional.
Well, I mean, like a big motivator of useless economic activity is just the servicing of debt.
Yes.
I mean, people just have to go out and find something to do, whether or not it's required or not, and whether or not it does damage or not. They just need to get an income coming through their position any way they can.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the other half of the equation, right? We've been saying that full employment is not necessary. It's not physically necessary to produce the goods and services we need collectively to survive and flourish. But the financial software insists that everyone has a job, or as many people as possible that we can, put in employment. That we've got to find work for all these people. And so what ends up happening is we end up creating jobs that are, to a greater or lesser extent, witless, useless, redundant and or destructive, not because we need people to be doing those things, but because we have to have an excuse, a justification for providing them with an income.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this is, I'm a fan of David Graeber, who wrote a book on this very thing called bullshit jobs. And through surveys, he found that between 30 and 40% of people believe the jobs they do, make no positive difference at all.
mhm.
They provide nothing for anybody really, except an income for themselves. And of course, people are in a very real way trapped because you've got bills, you've got debt to pay, you've got a mortgage, and you can't decide that you're not going to participate in it,
Right.
without financial ruin. And people say, oh, well, if you don't like your job, you can always go and get another one. But that's not that easy either.
Mhm.
In Australia, for instance, I know that 90% of employment is actually in the services industry.
90%.
90%, yeah. As machine, as machine production takes the jobs, and we obviously have exported a great deal of those production jobs overseas as well. There just isn't the useful work available to do, and that's very. David Graeber writes, it's very mentally distressing. Like it has a terrible psychological impact. People going to work believing that what they're doing is completely pointless. Yeah.
So I don't want to put anyone on the spot or offend anybody, but concretely, what sort of jobs could we give as examples of useless employment?
Well, one of the case studies he looks at is the FIRE sector, which is finance and real estate. So I think because there's a lot of money going into those positions, they have a lot of room to put people on. And, he says it's just they're just employing people because they can. And they're getting they do quite well, of course. And he says there's a relationship between, a positive relationship between being paid more money and the uselessness of your job. This is what he claims. So those sorts of jobs, like a lot of the paper pushing jobs, there'd be a lot of government jobs that would fall into that category. I mean, government has enormous power to create jobs.
Yes.
Because they can always take on more debt. They've got the taxpayer standing behind them, and there's sort of almost no limit.
Yeah.
I mean, they mizzle about credit ratings and so on, but
yeah.
So I think the lack of meaningful employment, is partly has a lot to do with why we see this growing bureaucratization and sort of compliance bureaucracy and that sort of thing as well.
Right. That these are all compliance bureaucracy, as you describe it, is basically make work.
Sure. Yeah.
Create jobs for people that need jobs, so we'll make stuff up, and a lot of that work too could cause a lot of difficulties and annoyances to other parts of the population. In other words, it's one thing to give these people useless, meaningful jobs, but because they've got to kind of go through the motions, they're subjecting other people with the necessity of filling out these forms and, jumping through these hoops and crossing their T's and dotting their I's, which is an absorption of their time and energy and resources, which could have been spent on other things. Right. So it introduces a tremendous amount of waste, sabotage, and inefficiency into the system, simply so that we can maintain this axiom. Now everyone's got to have a job, everyone's got to work, and this is the only way of distributing purchasing power for most people. So I was thinking, what should be done about this whole situation? I mean, if we had a rational economic system, a rational financial system, we're not going to insist on a policy of full employment if full employment is not actually needed. Rather, if we had an efficient economy, we would insist on something like the minimum employment necessary. But this would require changing the whole culture, changing the educational system so that we educate people we educate people for leisure, not leisure understood as idleness or, laying about or this sort of thing, but leisure meaning you put people in a position where they have the experience and the knowledge to decide for themselves how best to spend their time, how to profitably spend their time. And so the whole orientation of society would have to change if we had, let's say, a Douglas social credit system in place, which paid us all a dividend through monetary reform, paid us all what some social creditors referred to as the wages of the machine. We would have to adapt, and it's something that would probably take a generation or two, a number of years, because the existing obsession with work and jobs and employment, which has intensified, in the last few decades, because there was a time when many women didn't work, and that was just normal. But now everyone's got to work.
Yeah,
it's become worse with time.
I think the more immediate problem is a confrontation of power. Like, to some extent, we have this system because it's a very efficient way of keeping people under control. I'm not sure what you think about this, but if you've got everyone at the grindstone 9 to 5, they never have quite enough money to live, they're always in debt. It keeps them on this plane of consciousness where they're continually worried about their own material position. How am I going to look after my kids? How am I going to meet the bills, etc.? There's a number of levers in finance and government. For instance, taxation. We're seeing interest rates screw down on people now. Cost of living pressures that can be altered to kind of keep people in this perpetual state of insecurity and worrying about not exactly in Australia where their next meal is coming from, but just keeping them worried about the future all the time. And in my view, this is actually Douglas's second chapter in social credit was called Industry, Government or Service. And I think what he was pointing at there was industry has become a type of government, as time's gone on and this issue has festered and not been addressed at all, obvious as it is, I think it becomes clearer that is actually the intention. It doesn't matter if people are doing useless work, because the purpose is not the work they're doing at all. It's actually keeping them busy is the point. Keeping them busy and having some constant excuse for keeping them worried about their future.
Right. I definitely think that the policy of full employment also serves a political purpose of the nature that you're describing, that it's actually part of a control mechanism, keep everyone busy. They don't have time to think or ponder or reflect or ask questions or organize.
Sure.
Because they're always in survival mode, week to week, month to month, etc. And if you add in the fact that many of them probably realize that what they're doing is pointless, useless, waste of time, it's also then demoralizing on top of everything else.
Yeah.
So, they're not really making a bona fide contribution to the common good. I actually wrote a book.
To not work is demoralizing, but now to work is demoralizing for many people. I mean, not all, of course, but
yes. And there's plenty of, I mean, what are you defining as work? Of course, we're talking. So on this subject of, full employment being a kind of government and a way of controlling people, controlling the population, keeping them busy so they don't have time or energy to actually reflect and make different choices. I think one of the points that we want to make, where Douglas social credit is concerned, is that if we had an honest financial system that accurately reflected reality, which means that, giving everybody a dividend, whether they're employed or not, financed through monetary reform, not through redistributive taxation or debt, we'd actually have a financial system that frees people. It would be emancipating. So if people are, those who are in favor of freedom, who are genuinely in favor of freedom for the individual, they should not be in favor of full employment, because full employment, when it's not necessary, it actually doesn't serve any objective purpose, is a form of slavery. Right?
And it introduces a lot of distortions into the system, as we've been discussing, big government, big corporations, the people who are best placed to employ people, that is the people with lots of financial access, basically, it's a mechanism for drawing power to themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because they have all these people that they have to marshal and direct and monitor and reward and punish
and rely on them.
Yeah. Yeah. So freedom, I think one of the points I was about to make was that, when we talk about work in this context, we're talking about paid employment, whether self-employment or working for someone else. But of course, there's plenty of work to be done in the world. If work just means meaningful activity, there are plenty of things that people could and should be doing, things that would benefit themselves and benefit their communities and benefit the planet. So we're not suggesting that we should establish a society where people are idle, or people don't do anything, or they just drink and look at football all day long. The freeing up that we're talking about by providing a dividend and going from a full employment system to a policy of the minimum employment necessary, as far as the formal economy is concerned, this actually would free people up in terms of time and energy and resources to do other things that perhaps are not economically rewarding or not economically viable, but they're still very worthwhile, still very important, would be very enriching to the wider community. And this would, free up that energy so that people could actually do those things. And as difficult as it may be to understand in our money-obsessed, work-obsessed present, civilization, there were times and places in the past, in some cases, we're not talking about the distant past either, where people willingly volunteered their time for community projects of various kinds, and this was something that was part of building up the community. So, why can't we reach
even more basic things than that? I mean, one of the starkest indictments of our present system is that a lot of people feel as though, well, not just feel as though, they can't afford to look after their own kids. That's got to be done by a third party, because the government provides money for daycare, but not for people to do the job themselves. So
you have another situation where we create jobs. You don't have the time or the energy or the resources to look after your own kids, but you can farm them out, if you will, and have an institution, whether private or public, or a private-public partnership, raise your kids for you.
That's right.
Yeah, which of course
Mm.
provides more employment. And so
In the name of liberation of women.
yes, yes. So over time, in the last few decades and indeed centuries, more and more of our life has become monetized. And there are those on both sides of the political spectrum, I think, who regard this as some sort of, as authentic progress, and that the final utopia will be reached when you have to pay for everything. Everything is owned by somebody. You have to pay for everything. And the title to get anything is to perform some kind of paid employment. And outside of that, there's nothing of value or nothing worth doing or nothing. And this is very destructive. Economics, as Douglas said, economics actually should be a small and an increasingly small part of our life. Right? He talks about how
It could be, couldn't it?
yeah,
With all this automation that we have, and apparently all this automation we can expect with AI and so on, it should be being a diminishing part of our lives. It
yeah.
should be freeing us to think about more perhaps important or profound things.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, the Thomist philosopher Josef Pieper wrote a book called Leisure is the Basis of Culture. And the whole idea behind that is if you want a rich, thriving, noble culture, people have to have leisure. And if you destroy leisure, what happens to culture? What kind of culture do you end up with?
Mm.
So,
I think we're finding that out.
indeed. One of the points Douglas makes, this isn't an exact quote, but he says that, in the course of biological development, there have been times and places where an organism, for example, has dedicated all of its time and energy simply to the act of breathing. But eventually, as the organism develops and takes on new abilities and new powers, the act of breathing becomes more and more automatic, where it's not the centerpiece of existence. And he thinks that in the natural course of the evolution of civilization, if the present financial system doesn't collapse and destroy everything in the meantime, that we should reach a stage where this sort of focus on economic tasks and employment, this won't be the center of our attention. It will become a more or less automatic activity that will be minimized, and we will direct our effort toward new things, other things, cultural activities, spiritually enriching activities. And this whole sort of hand-to-mouth existence, obsessing about jobs and work and money, will fall by the wayside because it's no longer, thanks to technological development, it no longer merits the kind of focus or attention that we've been giving it.
Does he not say there also that species seem to reach a threshold where
Yes,
they either must develop or die?
right. Right. He talks
They
about
must,
life.
break into the next phase of development or
Yeah.
perish.
Yes, he talks about the life cycle of like insects, for example, and says there comes a stage where they have to jump to the next form of existence, or they perish.
Yeah.
So whether you think about caterpillars and butterflies or whatever, you have to go through a metamorphosis and exist on a new plane, or that's the end of your life cycle.
Yeah.
So
This obsession with work is just keeping us down, isn't it?
yes, it's totally regressive and counterproductive, reactionary. And when we haven't talked about this so much, but it's something that we should definitely add to the conversation here. You have all these futurists who are saying with things like automation and artificial intelligence, that whatever the case is now, whether it's we've got 40% useless jobs or 50% useless jobs or 60%, whatever it is, in another 10, 15, 20 years, how many jobs are we going to have? Most jobs, most existing jobs will in whole or, at least partially be subject to automation and to being replaced by artificial intelligence. So the problem isn't going away, it's actually intensifying, where we can't meaningfully employ everybody now, and it's going to become harder and harder to do so in the future. So if we, in the face of those sorts of developments, where maybe we only need 10% of the people to be working or 5% of the people to be working because machines are doing most everything else, in that kind of context, if we insist on a policy of full employment, what sort of work are we going to have people doing? What, if you talk about MMT, modern monetary theory, and this notion of the job guarantee, where the government becomes the employer of last resort, if we can't fit people into the private sector, but we say everyone's still got to work, what sort of jobs is the government going to have people doing?
Well, that's a worry, isn't it?
Hmm.
Because I think we've shown that we can provide jobs. If we don't have to make jobs useful, or, if we can make pointless jobs, we can make pointless jobs into infinity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like a nation or the globe or whatever the reach of this thing just becomes a kind of totalitarian work camp.
That's right.
As long as you're showing up and punching in and got your grey overalls on, you're going to get your ration.
Yes. Yeah.
And
if you combine that with sort of the political, cultural climate, I'm thinking here, won't give any specific examples, but if you think of wokeism, or the woke ideology, and all the sort of manifestations that we see of it in terms of what could only be described as social engineering, you can imagine what sort of jobs, what sort of maybe monitoring and compliance jobs might be created in order to keep people employed that have served no purpose except to impose a certain worldview and ideology on the rest of the population. I probably shouldn't even say this because I'm giving the other side ideas.
It'll be everybody watching everybody else.
Yes. Yeah. So it actually evolves into communism, as much as libertarian types or right wingers might say, oh, welfare is horrible, which I'm not pro welfare, but everyone's got to have a job. Everyone's got to work really, really hard. This is antiquated thinking, and it can only end in a totalitarian communist work state where people are being told what to do by the power structure, and it's all nonsense. It's all waste and sabotage. So the conservative element in society really needs to wake up to this whole question of finance, and also to the reality of technological progress. And we need to adapt. We need, as you were saying, you need to adapt the civilization to live on a different plane of existence, or we are threatened with collapse, destruction.
The philosophical key to it, if you like, is to make sure that all this organization, this whole productive enterprise preserves the autonomy of the individual, rather than continually forcing him to do things.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So
forcing him into situations that he doesn't control and can't control.
That's right. So true freedom, if you're really in favor of freedom, then all this technological advancement should free the individual, not further enslave the individual. And the only way
I think we'd better leave it there, Oliver.
No worries. I'll just finish by saying the only way to achieve that, of course, is to change the financial system, monetary reform, right? Which is what we advocate. This is the key to ensuring that the system and the technology will actually serve the individual, free the individual, expand the autonomy of the individual, and not actually produce the opposite effect, ironically, make the individual more and more a slave to technology. Yes. All
And
right.
there's every reason to believe that it would knock a lot of the inefficiencies and kinks out of the system. Like, it wouldn't be enormously disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
The whole profit motive, all of the things that we like about the free market would stay in place
It's all retained.
and just become more functional with sufficient consumer buying power in the hands of society.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. So please like and subscribe, and feel free to comment, and we will join you next week on another Douglas social credit topic, and we look forward to your feedback.
We have websites as well, socred.org and thepeoplescredit.com.au. There's a lot of stuff there that can bring you up to speed on what we're talking about. Thanks very much.
Thank you.